Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are crime dramas. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Season 1, Episode 4 of A Murder at the End of the World. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Do apologize, I'm getting to this fairly late. I don't know if this is going to go up today or whether I'm just going to go ahead and just make it go up tomorrow when I watch Episode 5. But that's, once again, a me thing. I'm going to start off with the past stuff because that's typically how I handle this, but it was really interesting. Obviously, they are continuing their investigation. They're meeting up with another fellow sleuth, amateur detective, kind of, I think, from their online community named Sue. And they went to identify the body of these bones based on dental records. And it ends up being this woman, Carmen. But amongst her stuff, because I think the wound that was on her head, it made Darby decide, like, no, let's look through the evidence and see if there's any connection. And they end up finding like a silver ring. So it's like, right, she's part of the pattern. She's another victim in this serial killer situation. So, which ends up being this interesting conversation between Darby and Bill, where it's like, right, a serial killer, maybe he has more victims out there, maybe he doesn't. We are nearing the end. Well, we know that the hotel they end up staying at, right where they're at, currently, is the hotel that they're at the end of their business. So we might be closing in on that. To be fair, there's only 3 episodes left anyway. I think the show's only 7 episodes long anyway, but that's so interesting because they're like, right, maybe there's more victims out there or maybe there aren't. But as we find out, it's like Darby says that most likely serial killers, it's hard to track their victims and connect them because no matter how far back you go, you might not be able to find any connections because they seem so sporadic and the reason for the victims being chosen the way they are. But typically the first victim is someone that the killer typically will know, which we know that is the case because we learned in episode 1, the serial killer's victim is their wife. And once again, I think it's so interesting is we kind of know who the killer is, but we've never actually seen their face because they kind of obscured that in the first episode. So I'm assuming we will eventually run into the killer. I think it's going to be a thing of we run into them and then it's going to be like, oh, it's this person. Oh, I'm curious, is Bill and Darby's interaction with them in the room is the first time they'd ever seen his face? No, because they had his address, so they knew what he looked like ahead of time. It's just we haven't been shown who the killer is, like what they look like in the confines of the show, because their face was obscured. I was wondering, sometimes you always wonder whether that's just like an aesthetic choice or whether that's like, no, you're hiding that identity for a reason because it's going to come back in some shape or form in the story and it's going to be story relevant, plot relevant. Maybe not necessarily the face reveal. Maybe it just depends on if Darby and Bill interact with this person during their investigation in some shape or form. I have to wait and see. We also learned something, learned something really interesting about Bill. He has something called a shoe syndrome. I'm not going to, it's an acronym. I actually looked into it. It is something real. Once again, just a quick Google search, but what I saw was like 17 to 35% of the population have it. It's one of those things. I'm like, I'm 31 years old. I've never heard of shoe syndrome before. Not saying like, oh my God, like how could I not? There's plenty of syndromes you never hear about, but like someone, the sudden exposure of light making someone sneeze is so fascinating. Obviously, it becomes extremely plot relevant when we find out about Zoomer having it. So I'm like, oh, okay. Because also during that whole situation in the past, we learned from Bill, hey, my mom went to a fortune teller, and which I think that sequence says a lot about Bill too, where he's like, my mom went to a fortune teller, and he's like, I want to have 7 kids, but my mom's fortune teller was like, yo, I'm going to have 1 kid with the person I sleep with only 1 time. And Darby's almost like, right, you don't really believe that. He's like, no, that's why he wants to have 7 kids too. So life isn't set in stone, that you do have a little bit more control over your life. You want to kind of fight back, and it's like, oh, I'm supposed to only have 1 kid. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have 7 kids just to kind of spike that, just to show that my life isn't so set in stone. It turns out it's the case, because jumping ahead to the end of the episode, present day, we find out that Zoomer is alert. Well, he sneezes when he's suddenly exposed to light. So so he is Bill's kid. I figured as much, but because someone had thrown out there like maybe there's a more technological element to this show, which still could be, but I felt like Zoomer, I kind of was buying into like maybe Zoomer, maybe there is some I mean, I guess he could be like some next life form, but he has certain aspects from Bill. Maybe that's what it. But I was right because like just their interaction, the look between him and Lee, it's like it felt like that was like you're like that Bill's the dad situation. But I was like, I second guessed myself. So like I said, there still could be a more science fictional angle to the direction they're going in a more technological base. Like there could be something to that, but maybe there is a little bit of Bill's coding there because maybe it's like, oh, maybe you specifically take after. If Zoomer ended up being something technologically, I wonder. Well, because we don't know if Bill has any like allergies to food or whatever. Because remember, Andy stopped Zoomer from eating like a very specific thing in episode one. Be like, no, we don't feed him that. And I was like, I don't remember if Bill was at the table at that time. I don't think he was. So we don't really know if Bill like has like very particular diet, or maybe it's just Andy's doing that because of the state of the world, and he wants his son not to have like maybe like certain things in his body. So once again, that might also tie into like the science fiction technological element of it. Like because someone got that in my head, I can't get that out of my head now. Like maybe there is like maybe he's like an android or something, but they use Bill as the basis because of him. But I think if that ended up being the case, if there ended up being some android element to it, I think it'd be interesting and ironic considering Bill's whole kind of art and everything was about being the dangers of technology. I think that'd be the irony behind it, but we'll see whether or not the kid ends up being like flesh and blood. Like I said, it never crossed my mind for the show to like really lean into the more technological stuff until someone else kind of was saying I was probably underestimating how much of an impact on the story that was going to have. We'll see, but because what also doesn't help is that Lee said that they only slept together once, and it never. Because I guess that's why Darby also asked me because maybe it's not until. I was curious whether Darby had asked that on purpose because she remembered what Bill said all that time ago, or it could just be a thing of it's been a couple years, so she might not have remembered that very specific conversation, and it only registered to her now because she was slipping into non-consciousness because she had a concussion, and it just maybe this is her first time thinking about that in such a long time, so maybe that's kind of piecing that together. But it's like it was a very specific thing she had asked at the time. I mean, because she already figured she thought something's happened between them anyway. So it's like, didn't Lee lie? Because she made it sound like they she made it seem like it wasn't something to completion. She was saying something of the sort like Bill couldn't get it up because of it, and she felt awkward. I guess maybe that was just my own interpretation. Like either she lied just to spare Darby's feelings because it's like, well, Bill is dead now, so what will do telling you the truth matter? Or it's just like, maybe it's they did have a completion. I mean, maybe it was to completion, or maybe they did actually go through with it one time. Maybe after that it was awkward and stuff like that. Because she made it sound like they only hooked up the one time. Maybe because nothing happened the second time because of how awkward it is, or maybe. I don't know. Like, did Lee just straight up lie to her in that regard, though? I don't know. Because if Zoomer is Bill's kid, I don't know. I can only assume if she lied, it was just to spare Darby's feelings. Because it's like, well, Bill's not alive anymore, so why taint that? Even though I know, like, how Bill feels about you. And probably everything else she said was probably true of, hey, we were better as friends. I don't know. We'll have to wait and find out. But staying with the past... Well, it's pretty slick how they ended up getting to Miller's room at that motel/hotel, and that's pretty smooth. Just like, oh yeah, like just jumping in at the pool, coming wrapped into. Oh hey, sorry, we left our key in our room. Do you mind if we get a spare 115? We're the Millers. I was like, oh, that's pretty cute. Which how funny saying we're the Millers, considering there's a movie literally called We're the Millers. There was also some interesting developments in that motel where. I think this is our first time learning about Darby's mom just out of her life. Her mom didn't die, she just left. And it's like, oh, did you ever think about looking for her? And for Darby, it's like, why would I? Why would I want to look for someone who obviously didn't want to be in my life? But also, why would I try and find her? She knows exactly where I live. If she ever wanted to be found, she could always just show up on her doorstep. But once it ends up being that thing, just because I was watching something else recently that brings up, the whole element of, oh yeah, a parent that's out of your life. The problem is, once they're gone for so long, either she's just kind of moved on and feels like she has no right to come back in your life because it's like, you're better off without me. Who knows? I don't know if that's going to end up being plot relevant, whether that's just going to be flavor text to Darby's character, and maybe on some level it plays a role in her development and her being the way she is. Like, you probably can't say it has zero effect, because something like that will always affect you in some shape or form. It just probably depends on the severity in which it affects you. Maybe because everything they were dealing with that day, because she was the one like knocking back little shot bottles from the fridge. Even Bill was kind of like, oh, do you want to kind of slow that down a little bit? But then I guess, I don't know, maybe she was trying to also muster up the courage. Maybe a combination of drowning out everything they were kind of dealing with, but also building up the courage to her and Bill, doing their thing. Because he was also like, right, do you mind if we like shift the subject away from the killers? He's like, just for now, it's just a lie. Which sadly ended up being kind of a foundational part of their, like, they came together because of all of this, but it also became a lot. And then they almost get in the process of, like, she starts kissing him and she starts like initiating, but he's like, whoa, maybe we shouldn't. Now my initial thought, and maybe on some level this still could be applicable, but he gives his explanation, but my initial thought was, oh, did Bill not want to have sex with her because he was scared that it would fulfill that prophecy of, oh, the person I sleep with will only be one time and now be the person I have a kid with, and he doesn't want that to happen with Darby, especially because Darby had this conversation of, yeah, we're almost at the end, and oh, maybe we'll catch this guy. But for Bill, it's like, wait, like, this might be over. I think a little bit of that, plus like, oh, if I sleep with you one time, that means that's all we're gonna that means you probably won't be in my life or something like that. So that was my initial thought about why Bill didn't sleep with Darby in that moment, but they do the next morning, which is also sweet. He brings her coffee, and also I was like, oh, the Coca-Cola. I was like, that's actually really sweet, because you could tell that look when she woke up the next day and he was gone and she was scared, which is ironic considering that's exactly how that played out, at the end of their story before they met up again after these 6 years. So it is kind of sad, like, oh, she felt that initially, but she was all, okay, good, you're here. She was scared. Because I think maybe she was worried there was something wrong with her. But Bill ends up explaining, it's like, no, we're after a killer who hurts women, and I'm a man. And it made me feel weird at the time of just like everything happening. I could see that. Like, it's like, we're after a person who hurts women, and you're one, and it made me just start feeling kind of like weird and I think icky to an extent. And it's just, for him, it's like, I just want to know what you want. And she's like, I just want you to hold me. And she's like, do you want to kiss me right now? He's like, yeah, I do. And one thing leads to another, and they end up having sex. I doubt that's the only time they probably end up having sex. Maybe not. I don't know. But that's where we leave off in the past. Back in the present day, we end up in the bunker. Everyone's there except we don't know about the other staff members where they were sent off to. Like, maybe they were already sent home for the night or whatever. But we don't see the rest of the staff. But all the guests were all gathered in this little bunker area. It's like, oh, what happened to Rohan? And it's like, well, it seemed like a heart attack. But it's like, right, he does have a pacemaker. So both Lee and Darby, well, Darby kind of initiates, like, it might have been a hack, and Lee agrees as well, but it's not going to be something you could easily trace, because even saying, like, there's, like, medical equipment that could be modified to, like, keep track of someone's pacemakers, like, right, like, Rohan probably wouldn't have his on him, because Lume was like, yeah, my dad had one, but it, like, why would Rohan most likely wouldn't have his with him? But Lee starts suggesting, like, don't we have something in the medical bay that kind of could serve in that purpose? And it's like, yeah. And what's her name was like, yeah, when I went in there earlier, that was already out and it was on. So it's like, yeah, Rohan was murdered. So now the question is, well, who did it? Some people would even suggest, I think it was Lume in particular, was like, maybe it's even Andy. I mean, she's like, how genius is it to gather all your rivals and competitors and just anyone like of significance like that's kind of in your way, and kind of removing them from the equation one by one was kind of like a thought that Lume kind of put out there, because now it's like, oh, Bill suspiciously died. Everyone just was still quick to write it off as an overdose, and now this with Rohan. The staff is meant to keep their mouth shut, so Todd's not saying anything. The kind of butler dude isn't saying anything, so they're kind of keeping them all in the dark about all this. Because the biggest question too is why are all of us here, and why isn't Andy here? And I also love David being the douchebag and calling out Darby. He's like, "You fucking millennial," and then home dude, the movie maker, was like, "Dude, she's not a millennial." He's like, "I'm a millennial." It's just like David just uses every excuse to be a dick. It is interesting though, people who spoke up the most during that whole conversation end up being people who are the most suspect later on, when Darby and Sean get together, which I thought was interesting. Sean visited Darby after everyone was kind of sent to their rooms. Thought it was so interesting that this ended up being a quite Sean-focused episode, interestingly enough. We learned more about her. I mean, she obviously was on the suspect list, but Darby was like, oh, there's this, what was it, V or EMAC? It's basically like a text format that, like, depending on, like, hackers, it's like a thing, like, oh, depending, like, if you had a visceral reaction to it, like, even if it's a subtle one, most hackers would have one the moment you bring that up, because, like, it's a divide amongst hackers on which one. And so Sean didn't have that reaction, so it's like, oh, okay, so you're not a hacker, so you're not the person who killed Rohan, you're most likely not a person, because whoever killed Rohan also killed Bill, so Darby ends up letting her in on a lot of stuff. And because Sean, like, laments, like, hey, I trust, on my gut, I knew that there was something off about the Bill situation, that you were right, but I didn't want to listen, not only because you're so young, because I'm also a girl. And it's like, well, yes. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it. It felt like that conversation supposed to indicate, like, right, even women have their own biases against women. You know, there's the thing of, like, oh, a guy will most likely, not always, but is less likely to kind of really think much. For one, I mean, we even see it with David. David treats Darby like crap because she's younger and she's also a girl. Like, it's not like because in his eyes, she doesn't even see her as a woman. He sees her as, like, a little girl. So there's a little bit of that. But I think it's kind of indicating that even Sean has her biases where it's like, right, you're a girl. So, like, what do you know? Like, me, I'm me in my field. I'm accomplished. If anyone else had said it, sure. But it's like, and specifically using the phrase girl make me feel like it's meant to delineate even more of, like, not only young, you're like a girl, you're not a woman. That's how I'm reading, and like I said, I could be reading it way too much into it. So obviously she should have listened. It's like, if I'd listened to you when it came to the Bill situation, same thing for Andy. He should have listened to you. He was the one that was so quick to tell Darby, no, you're crazy. Like, it's nothing more than that. Yada yada, so on and so forth. I mean, he's the one that didn't, like, publicize, like, a lot of that stuff. Like, he waited to pull the trigger on some of that information last episode just so he could throw it in Darby's face, essentially. So he definitely has a lot to hide here, because even Sean doesn't know everything that this place is supposed to be. Sean even revealed, hey, this place, even I don't know, because Andy is claiming that, like, right, I'm supposed to be the head of a space program. That space program, is actually, I'm a figurehead for something that it doesn't exist. I'm the PR, I'm the face of it, but it doesn't exist. All that money's being funneled somewhere else, and even I don't know what he's funneling it into. Well, she assumes it's something here, but what this all entails, what he's got, like, the machinery that Oliver's building as well, we got introduced to that last episode. So there's correlations and connections. We just don't see the bigger picture, because the only person that has the bigger picture is Andy. But he's playing a lot of this close to the vest, and it makes you wonder, does anyone have the big picture? Because everyone probably has pieces to the puzzle. Like, Sean has a piece to it, Oliver has a piece to it, maybe Lee does. I'm sure even she doesn't know. And probably out of anyone, she probably knows the least amount compared to everyone. But I guess it's meant to be that compartmentalization of everyone excels at their individual places, and then the brainchild of it all, who has the greater vision, needs to kind of pull it all together. Kind of gives you Engstrom Levy vibes if you're caught up with Invincible. I don't know if that's a one-to-one for what it is in the comics, but at least with the TV show, Engstrom's perspective on things, of why he does what he does, I think there's correlations you can make with Andy in that same capacity. There are interesting people on the suspect list. Like I said, Lou May and David were the ones who talk the most. And so Lou Mee has reason to go after Bill because Bill, his art criticized what she was building, and that was smart cities. But David would have less reason to go after Bill or Rohan because at the end of the day, if David was going to go after anyone, it would be Lee. And it's like, well, why? It's like, well, the moment Lee got pregnant and all Andy focused on was his family, and it was just, I guess, because David's kind of, I don't know, venture capitalist would be the right word, but it's he's all about progressing forward, amounts of money we could make. It's just you let a lot of what we were working on, what we could have worked on, fall to the wayside for your family. So there's that thing of your family got in the way of it. So he's a little irked by that because he's the one that was in the first episode talking about like, oh yeah, the people that were brought here by Andy versus those who were brought by Lee. And it's like now you have that context of why he has such like discontent, and probably also why he like does not like Darby, because Darby probably reminds him so much of Lee that it like rubs him the wrong way. It feels like that might play a little bit of a element to this. I also learned a little bit about Sean in regards that we found out that her dad died when she was 13. In fact, he gassed himself to death in a garage. I'm assuming it's a very specific phrasing, but I'm assuming carbon monoxide poisoning. You know, I'd assume that's what she was saying, but I mean, maybe she meant not like I don't know. I interpreted it as, because that's usually when you're describing someone killing themselves in a garage, it's usually carbon monoxide poisoning in that regard. But she was 13 at the time, and he was an astronomer, but he went to the Gulf War, and I thought it was so interesting because Sean was like, "Yes, I know that the world can be tough on women." I was like, I know. She's like, I know that you know that better than anyone as well. And she was like, yeah, but the other side has it pretty tough too. It's like, imagine, being made into a killer when all you want to do is stare up at the stars. And just I guess that was just kind of like a lot for him, like going off to the Gulf War and just what he had to do, what his country kind of ordered him to do. And like I said, that line between what you have to do in the name of service and, I don't know, that's not always, once again, I'm coming from the perspective of never having been in the military, so I can't comment on that directly, but just from the outside perspective, which is, once again, I stressed it in another review, but being like, yeah, I have a very naive perspective on it, but it's still like, yeah, that is a lot to people. Like, it's not the easiest thing to handle when you've done something like that and been a part of something like that. Whether, I mean, even if you were kind of in the right, once again, your battle between your consciousness and what you have to do for your country, because you are in your military, you have to follow orders, and whether it's just something that you did in the line of duty because you were ordered to do, or whether it's just something you did because it was like either them or me, and either way, that's still going to mess with you in some level. So they never got in contact with the person that Rohan was kind of messaging, but they ended up finding a Zodiac, a little like blow up boat, so that meaning that his ship, which has a very specific name because even it came up and Darby was like, oh, that's the ship of his that he was on, and so it must be somewhere in the distance that you'd have to row to it, but it's nearby. So it makes you wonder how big is the group that they're involved with. What is this all about? Have no idea. But it is interesting that they made it there fine, but the trip back is where the snowmobile shut down. To be fair, it's like, right, more snow is pouring down, got in some stuff. It made it seem like an engine got clogged, which obviously entirely possible, but just think it's interesting you were able to make it all the way there, just not bad. But to be fair, the storm got worse, so maybe there's nothing nefarious there. They're trudging back. I was like, oh, this is going to be bad. Like, one of them's not going to make it back. Jumping ahead a little bit, both of them coming out of this alive super surprised me. I was so certain Sean was going to die. And I was like, for her to live, I was like, oh, that's interesting. But we'll get to that more in a second. So they end up finding, I thought they were going to bunker down at that place, but I guess like the door would probably be locked and there'd be no way to get inside. But luckily a vehicle was there. They're inside. The moment they took their helmets off, I was like, something suspicious about that. Because I was like, the moment they took their helmets off and put them in the back seat, I was like, that's weird because they focused on it a lot. Now, what makes me wonder is, was the helmet that Sean put on her helmet, or was it Darby's helmet? I mean, yeah, they put their helmets in very specific places, but in the rush of things, maybe she. Well, you also have to remember, like, the car ended up crashing, so stuff got flipped. They flipped a couple of times, so she might not have picked up her helmet. The helmet that Sean picks up later might have actually been Darby's helmet, so it might have been meant for Darby to die. We don't know. You can't delineate between those two helmets, so that has to be something considered. But obviously it's because of the black eye situation, and they end up tumbling. Though Darby was kind of a little nervous the moment she her saw Sean hacking the vehicle. It's like, right, I know vehicle commands. It's like, yeah, but I thought you weren't a hacker. She'd even said it herself that Andy referred to this place as a conference of hackers, and it's like, but you're not a hacker. But it's like, oh, maybe she is. So it's like Darby was kind of nervous at that moment because it's like, maybe I was too quick to take you off the suspect list. But yeah, the car tumbled a couple times. Darby was like unconscious for like 25 minutes. I think even after being unconscious for any amount of time is scary, but the longer it is, the worse, because that could be extensive. There could be extensive brain damage, like the longer you are unconscious. So it's not a good idea that, if you have a concussion, like even being out for like a minute, still kind of a bad thing. But being out for like 25 minutes is pretty bad. Luckily, Sean was able to drag her back. But I was like, oh my God, don't tell me Sean's going to die in a car accident. Especially when she had that whole point of, hey, if I don't make it out of this alive, you need to make sure you don't say anything but about the whole space program and that money and stuff. Like, keep that to yourself. But I was like, it felt like, they purposely gave her the red flag so you think she died. But then all of a sudden when she wakes up and home dude, I think her name was Ava, is like giving her the morphine. She's like, no, I don't want the morphine. I don't want it. But it's like, don't worry, you're only going to get a small amount. And at the same time, Sean can't get her helmet off. She's running out of oxygen. It's like, right, the helmet's had someone overrode the helmet and made it so that she will suffocate. And like, wow, I was like, oh, so she is going to die. Luckily, they perform a tracheotomy and are able to give her air before she suffocates. So I'm like, okay, good. Sean's still alive, luckily enough. But my point still remains. That might not have been meant for Sean. It might have been meant for Darby. Because the helmets might have gotten mixed up. Because I wonder, when was this setup in place? Like, maybe when you take the helmet off and put it back on after a certain amount of times, maybe the override automatically kicks in. Or maybe it's a situation of like, moment they found out they put the helmets back on, then they activated it. But maybe they didn't realize, like, I don't know if it connects any biometrics to tell you like, oh, Sean putting the helmet on, can you register that it was Sean that put the helmet on? Or do you or is it initially registered to the first person who put it on, which would have been Darby's, if it was Darby's. Maybe it was Sean the entire time. Maybe it was like, maybe you were always aiming for Sean. Maybe you were going to kill both of them, but Darby didn't have her helmet on because Sean didn't put it on her, because I guess like maybe in that situation it's best not to put her helmet on considering she had a concussion, so her helmet probably just got left behind. So many different ways that could be, so we'll ultimately have to wait to see where all this takes us. Obviously, like I said, I'm recording this late, so the new episode did drop today, so I'm interested to see where all this takes us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.